Scottish Parliament, adjourned on the 25th day of March in the year 1707, is hereby reconvened. Those, Mr Deputy Speaker, were the words of Winifred Margaret Ewing, elected to the House of Commons 50 years ago this year, more fondly known as Winnie, and to our EU friends, Madam Ecos. Winnie, to this day, is the only parliamentarian of these islands to be a member of the Scottish, British and European Parliaments. She will be the only person who will hold that accolade. It's almost 20 years today since Scotland said yes to a Scottish Parliament with devolved powers and a settlement that stated everything is automatically devolved unless it is explicitly reserved. Those powers, despite what one honourable member said earlier, were not notional. And as the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, rightly said in her speech this morning of this bill, the bill threatens the very principle on which our Parliament was formed. This bill, in its current form, Mr Deputy Speaker, in my view, is a reversal of devolution. And I am really struggling, despite the fact that I'm a pretty positive person, to find light amongst the Brexit process. Because after a summer of meetings with people in businesses and trade bodies in my Livingston constituency across Scotland and the UK to understand their hopes and fears about Brexit, it's hard to see good in any of it. The retail sector in my constituency employs a high number of EU nationals. And just to take one example, is the insurance sector and the aviation sector.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I'll be happy to give way to my honourable friend.
As my honourable friend knows, I have an airport and an important aerospace cluster in my constituency. Is she not concerned about the loss of open skies and also the loss of the European Aviation Safety Agency? We might not be able to pass the engines. Maybe it doesn't matter because we'll not be allowed to fly anyway.
Indeed, I share my honourable friend's concerns, and I'm sure she'll share the concerns of the insurance sector, who talk about aviation as an example, because national airlines based in any EU country require a range of specialist insurance cover. Most of this is a mandatory requirement in order to operate. The UK insurance market is the only location with specialist aviation insurance knowledge and financial capacity to provide the full coverage to all of the risks faced. I won't at the moment. I'm going to make some progress. Put simply, planes, as my honourable friend has identified, will not be able to take off. And the reality of this EU withdrawal bill is it presents a real concern that amongst the many aspects the UK Government may use Clause 8 to trigger Article 127 of the EEA agreement, immediately ripping away the UK's access to free movement of goods, people, services and capital. And as the days pass, the fear and concern heightens. Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, just said this morning, and added to the list of Brexit superlatives, saying the Conservative Government are headed towards a kamikaze Brexit. In a single act of complete recklessness, that the Government is pressing ahead, no I won't at the moment, this deficient bill without having carried out proper economic analysis on any economy across the UK. The people and businesses I have spoken to, Mr Deputy Speaker, do not want to fall off a cliff before new trade deals can be agreed. They cannot afford to crash out of the EU or fall back on WTO rules, which the CBI chairman has identified as opening a Pandora's box. The gap between any transitional period and any trade deal starting is also a real threat. Agriculture, fisheries and the environment are just some of the areas devolved to Scotland which will be affected by this bill. And the Fraser of Allender Institute has shown that a hard Brexit could cost Scotland's economy, its GDP, up to £10 billion and 80,000 jobs in Scotland. Mr Deputy Speaker, that's almost the entire number of people in my constituency. Now, the Scottish Government did try to look for a compromise. It put forward its proposals in Scotland's place in Europe. Not even a decent response. I won't at the moment. I'm going to make some progress. In fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, the former Prime Minister David Cameron didn't even allow his civil servants or advisers to write anything down before Brexit, and the Brexit Secretary admitted to the committee that there was no proper assessment of the economic consequences if there was no deal. What a reckless and incompetent way to run a government or a country. And I know some of the magnitude of this is hard to comprehend, but to go to the people of this country with no proper impact assessment to be done and no proper detail is absolutely scandalous. The Conservative Government pledged to bring forward a repeal bill to allow for a smooth and orderly transition as the UK leaves the EU. But what this bill seeks to do is undermine the devolved settlements and offer no guarantees to the devolved nations on the protections of their powers. Michelle Barnier told a recent press conference there's been no decisive progress in talks with the UK at the conclusion of the third round of negotiations. So, while the government's faffing about, time is not on the side of people, businesses and our industries. And perhaps even more damaging than the tardy approach to the negotiating a transition is the admission that this government has turned down countries wishing to strike trade deals after Brexit because the government doesn't have the capacity to negotiate them. Furthermore, since the government's approach to the immigration was leaked, there's now a very real risk that the transition period could be under threat. And those in the legal profession have also raised concerns. Lord Judge, the former Lord Chief Justice, has warned Parliament faces a legislative tsunami without time to properly scrutinise the legislation. If the parliamentary processes are broken, I'll be happy to give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She praised Lord's Judge, and it's fair to say he's not the only senior magistrate who has problems with this bill. The outgoing President of the Supreme Court, Lord Neuberger, said on Clause 6 that if the government doesn't express clearly what judges should do about decisions of the ECJ after Brexit, or indeed any other topic after Brexit, then the judges will simply have to do their best. But to blame the judges for making the law when Parliament has failed to do so would be unfair. He's right, isn't he?
Yes, he is. And Mr. Speaker, the government had to, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government had to be dragged through the courts to even give Parliament a say on triggering Article 50. What hope do we have that we will be able to properly scrutinise the 19,000 laws and regulations that will be coming back from the EU? Last week, the Scottish Government announced an ambitious and inclusive programme for government, putting carbon capture back on the table where this government failed, and committed to establishing a Scottish investment bank. They should be delighted. But what has the UK government been doing? It's been doing Brexit, just Brexit, and nothing else. And it cannot make progress with that. Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, that is what doing the day job really looks like. And as we get on with the day job in Scotland, Westminster is going to be bogged down in nothing but Brexit. This bill threatens the very foundations of democracy.
Just one. Mr. Graham, you've spoken. If the Honourable Lady wishes to give way, she'll indicate to you, but I certainly don't need you hanging on the 2 feet for the rest of the speech. Anna Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This bill threatens the very foundations and transparency of our democracy. There are voices of agreement and consensus around this chamber, and it is incumbent upon us to, where we can find agreement, that we work together. But this bill and the Tory government's antagonistic approach gives little space and opportunity for any collaboration. Mr. Deputy Speaker, with no clear answer around EU nationals' rights, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and single market membership under threat, and no detailed economic analysis on the effect of the UK leaving the single market, this bill is a wrecking ball to British democracy and the cross-party working and consensus that created the Scottish Parliament. The government cannot hide behind this "what the people voted for" line, because the reality is nobody really knows what they voted for. There was no white paper, no positive proposition, no detail, nothing written down. Many who voted now are full of regret and frustration because they were sold a pup. We will not stand by and support this bill. We will not give it a second reading because 2 decades after Scotland voted for a Scottish Parliament and giants of Scottish politics like Donald Dewar and Winnie Ewing ushered in a new era of positivity that has benefited everybody in Scotland, this bill is the biggest power grab since devolution. We in the SNP will not stand by and allow Scottish democracy and our Parliament's powers to be eroded.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to follow the right and honourable member for Livingston, who gave an interesting speech. Mr. Deputy Speaker, without the iconic and much-loved bongs of Big Ben, the Palace of Westminster may appear diminished, but the EU withdrawal bill, however, will ensure that this palace is more sovereign and more accountable with or without its hourly chimes. This bill will restore this nation's sovereignty, restore the supremacy of this Parliament and restore the self-determination of the British people. The final word on law will be ours, and I am happy to trust the judgment of our Supreme Court rather than the European Court of Justice. It will be the British people who will ultimately be entirely in control of the direction of our country. If they don't like what they see here in Parliament or don't feel represented by their MPs, they can vote us out. That is not the case for unelected, unaccountable Eurocrats. This bill is the logical step, the next step in leaving the European Union. what the public have trusted us to do. The key point of this bill is to provide certainty as to how the law will apply after we leave the European Union. It is an unprecedented period in our history, which is why so much has been and will continue to be debated. But to vote against this bill is purely political game playing and ignoring the will of the British public. The public have a right to ask objecting members who are arguing against converting the EU regulations and law into domestic law on exit day, where were your objections when the laws were enacted in Brussels and enforced on us in the first place? The bill maximises stability and certainty, which is what our economy needs and what our businesses require and deserve. The bill ensures that consumers have clarity about their protection, employees clarity about their rights, businesses have certainty, and fundamentally, the rights and protections are enforceable through the UK courts, which are renowned the world over. Many Wilden businesses and farms from Halsham